So I want to welcome our guests on stage, Dr. Bruno Macias, best-selling author and former Secretary of State for Europe in Portugal, Dr. Vali Nasser, Majid Kaduri, Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies, Johns Hopkins SAIS, non-resident Senior Fellow, Atlantic Council South Asia Center, and Dr. Charles Kupchan, Professor of International Affairs, Georgetown University, and Senior Fellow, Council on Foreign Relations. Gentlemen, welcome. Now, I know you all came here with something to say, and before I get into questions, I want to give each of you the floor to get your ideas off your chest first. And when you look at the name of this panel, The Return of Geopolitics, what are the ideas, what are the thoughts that first come into your mind? What are the challenges facing the order, the return of rivalries? What does this mean to you? So I want to give you guys each 3 to 5 minutes to come with some ideas and some thoughts, and then we'll continue with follow-up. So Bruno, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. I think you're right that we're going through a transformation. Normal rules no longer apply. By the way, when I think about that idea that normal rules have disappeared, I always think about the pandemic, because that was a moment when everything seemed to change, and we seem to enter an extraordinary moment. There's no obvious connection between geopolitics and the pandemic, even though Presidents Putin and Xi Jinping often make the connection between the pandemic and a kind of more brutal geopolitics. But then after the pandemic, we saw in Ukraine the return of wars of conquest, the return of genocidal language in all types. The return of large refugee flows to Europe, and so on and so forth. And now, of course, Gaza. The sense is that everything is possible, that the unimaginable or the unthinkable could be the news tomorrow. And what that means for those of us that try to think a little bit more detached from the news of the day is simply that the existing order is unraveling. And when the existing order unravels, you return to a kind of state of nature, where again, physical force matters more than anything else. Military conflict is always present. And geopolitics in the old sense, geopolitics is a word invented about 100 years ago, in the old sense of struggle for control over territory, struggle between biological units, ethnic biological units, peoples that try to exert power over each other, and in the end perhaps even destroy each other. This seems to be the world we live in. Let me just say something quickly about the role of the United States, because that is really quite central. The United States was supposed to be the guarantor of the existing order, the enforcer of rules. It could enforce the rules very differently depending on the occasions. It could even try to evade the rules that it was trying to enforce. We used to call that hypocrisy. But hypocrisy had some advantages, that at least there were rules, not always followed the same by everyone. But what I find striking about this moment in Gaza is that it seems to be the end of hypocrisy. What we hear from US officials is not hypocrisy at all. It's just a very natural, direct expression that we are aligned with Israel and will support Israel no matter what it does. We saw the spokesman, John Kirby, the other day say that in an interview he was asked, will the US stop supporting Israel if Israel violates international law? And he said, no, we won't. We won't stop supporting Israel no matter what. We would prefer that Israel respects international law, but our support is not dependent on that, which is kind of an extraordinary statement, but we've seen many of those kinds. We saw that President Biden went and sat at the war cabinet in Israel, which perhaps was necessary and perhaps can be understood, and some people praised it as a show of solidarity, first time a US president had done that. But of course, again, if you try to detach yourself from the news of the day, it's an extraordinary decision, because the US was always supposed to be a mediator in the Middle East conflict. Now, if the mediator sits in the war cabinet to discuss war plans, I guess it is no longer the mediator, or no longer have a mediator, and Palestinians should no longer accept the US to play the role of a mediator, obviously, even though in the past there were many doubts about that role. What I think we're witnessing now is, again, the end of hypocrisy, that the US is clearly on one side of the conflict, and clearly saying that the rules that it talked about incessantly in the case of Ukraine don't apply here. What we're witnessing to conclude is simply the sense that the rules have disappeared. What matters is our side, the other side, and one of the sides must win. Now, I think we'll discuss later what happens now. Do we live in a world without rules, or is there some effort beginning to rebuild or create new rules for a new world? But it seems clear to me that the old rules no longer convince, no longer have force, and are just an image or a phantom.
Thank you, Bruno. Charles, the floor is yours for opening comments.
Thank you. In 1930, Antonio Gramsci, who was an anti-fascist and had been thrown into jail for challenging the rise of fascism in Italy, wrote a series of prison notebooks, they're now called. And in one of them, he wrote the following sentence, and I'm paraphrasing here. "The old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, very morbid symptoms appear." He was writing in 1930, the beginning of a quite dystopian decade, and I think in many respects, that's our moment now. The old is dying and the new cannot be born, and we are witnessing a range of morbid symptoms from what's happening in Ukraine to what's happening between Israel and Hamas to the growing rivalry between China and the United States. One order that really emerged after World War II, and in some ways all the way going back to the 19th century, is starting to come apart, and we have not yet begun to imagine what comes next. So let me take a few minutes just to dig down into that proposition. I think there are four fundamental changes taking place in the world that are moving us through a transformational moment. One is a shift in the global distribution of power from west to east and from north to south. We are headed from an era of unipolarity to an era of some mix of bipolarity, US, China, and multipolarity, because clearly what we're witnessing vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East is many countries in the global south, including this country, Turkey, they're not going to choose sides. They're looking at east, they're looking at west. One day they may align with the United States and its partners. The next day they may align with China and Russia. Very fluid world that is being expedited by this global redistribution of power. Second, we're in the transition from the industrial to the digital age. And that is both speeding the redistribution of power, but also undermining the social contract that emerged in the industrial era, particularly in those countries that were at the front of that era, the United States and its other liberal democratic partners. Third, we seem to have passed through a peak of globalization. We're witnessing the beginning of economic decoupling, supply chain repatriation, ban of semiconductors to China. It may well be that what Jake Sullivan calls high fence, small yard may turn into higher fence, bigger yard. And we see the gradual fragmentation of the global economic system. And then finally, I think we are witnessing in a very surprising and troubling way a stumbling within liberal democratic society. From the French and American revolutions until around 2005, the world got progressively more free. Now that arc in the direction of history has shifted in the other direction. The world is getting less free. In countries that we took to be beyond the point of no return in terms of liberal democratic institutions and practices, we see backsliding, including in my own country, the United States. And as a consequence, we have to ask whether the West will maintain its solvency, its purposefulness in terms of an anchor of the global system during this period. let me conclude with just two observations about where we go from here. One is that despite this fragmentation that I've been describing, we live in a world that is more globalized and interdependent than it's ever been. We cannot go back to something that resembles the world of the Cold War because we have climate change, because we've got migration, nuclear proliferation, pandemics. These challenges require collective initiative. And as a consequence, we need to find a way to secure cooperation across global geopolitical and ideological dividing lines. In my mind, the only way to get there, and this is my final point, is to move toward a world of polycentrism, of regional devolution, in which we find a way of agreeing on a core set of global rules that Bruno was talking about, but at the same time rely much more heavily on regions to provide governance at the local level. I think inevitably this is what a world of decentralized power and ideological diversity will mean. And then my final recommendation would be to deal with the internal threats to liberal democracy. Quite honestly, as an American, I'm much more concerned about us than I am about the threat posed by Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. Illiberal populism, the erosion of ideological centrism, the erosion of political moderation. I think these are more potent threats in many respects than the geopolitical threats that come from outside. And as a consequence, I think we need to get our own houses in order, get our own working classes back up on their feet if we are going to see the West anchor this critical moment of global transformation.
Thank you, Charles. Definitely getting the own house in order. I do think that's a very important point. Also to add, when you talked about globalization to economic decoupling, you talked about the hedging of geopolitical bets that countries are undertaking. I also think that we're in an era where the term shared values is also being redefined, but also created on a regional level as well. We're seeing a shared value system of the East, a shared value system of the Muslim world, because generally when you hear shared values, it's a message coming out of NATO, or a message coming out of the Western camp. But the East has its own set of values, and I think that has caused kind of a decoupling on many different levels as well. So thank you for your comments. I'm going to come back with follow-ups. Vali, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much and good morning. And building on what my colleague said here, I'm probably looking at it much more from the angle of the Middle East. I mean, looking at the title of this panel, The Return of Geopolitics, I would say, you know, there is the return of geopolitics at the global level, but it's also the return of geopolitics to the Middle East itself in new and sort of unforeseen ways. On the global level, you know, we're now being in at least in a period since the 3 American presidents, going back to President Obama, there's a recognition that sort of end of the globalization period, end of American unipolar domination of the world order, and the question of the rise of China, and particularly rise of China, not in the direction of it becoming prosperous, democratic, full member of what the West would see as the international liberal order, but the rise of China as a political entity that is going to be a great power in its own right, rival the United States, potentially have a larger economy than the United States, and not be democratic and be nationalistic. And I think this realization essentially gave a sense that we're entering a period of geopolitical competition, that the economics is not going to bring everybody together into one whole entity, and that the most important issue in the world is not fighting Islamic militancy or terrorism, which was the root of the global war on terror, but is actually competition between these great powers. Now, there is a reality to this. In other words, it's not just a perception, but you could also say that the United States began to foist China increasingly as a global rival, began to view the world in polar Cold War terms, which then imposes its own rules on various regions of the world. decisions they have to make in this kind of a rivalry. For the Middle East, the main consequence of this was a shift of attention from the Middle East as the most important geopolitical presence for the United States, militarily, diplomatically, to shift towards what President Obama called the pivot to Asia. In other words, we want to do less in the Middle East, we want to do more in Asia, that the great game is no longer in the Middle East, it's in Asia. And I think every country in the region, whether they were friends of the United States or enemies of the United States, felt this shift very, very acutely. I mean, you know, the way the United States left Afghanistan, the way that it left Iraq, you know, were very powerful statements, both to America's enemies as well as to America's friends. The fact that the United States is very clear that it's not interested in another war in the Middle East itself is a very, very important statement. The other side of this shift is that for the Middle East, at least the rise of China is real. It's not imaginary. In other words, there is much more presence of Chinese economic interest in the region, energy interest, but also China is increasingly becoming very significant to trade interests in the region, as well as to the technological and economic needs of the region. We often forget Middle Easterners, whether they're wealthy or poor, buy a lot from the West, but in terms of their own economic development, they need China in order to get the necessary technologies, manufacturing, et cetera. And without a link to China, it's not possible. So the Chinese have become much more important. Russia become much more important, although in a security sense after the war in Syria. Now, all of these are very important to the region, but so far what I'm saying is that the Middle East is basically feeling the impact of geopolitical, return of geopolitics to the world order. But within the region itself, there's now also geopolitics. In this sort of environment that has emerged, you have power centers in the region which are pursuing their own interests. And as Charles said, you know, many countries in the region are finding this space to act as emerging powers, what we now refer to as sort of a second level powers, middle powers, that basically not only they don't want to listen to Beijing or to Washington and want to take advantage of things as they are, but also they see the opportunity to position themselves as emerging powers. There's much more space for Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, et cetera, to exercise this role. And also they have realized that with the United States' interest in the region declining, they have to take care of their own issues. And so we're seeing, you know, relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, between Turkey and the Gulf countries, between Turkey and Iran. This idea of the Arab Islamic Summit that emerged was very, very key, that countries that have never talked to each other for a number of years, Syria, Iran, Egypt, they all appeared in the same place in order to take a problem that is regional, fully believing that the great powers are not going to solve this right away. And to this, I have to add, there is an economic dimension to this. Just before the Gaza war, some of the largest conversations in this region were about trade corridors, whether it's from you know, Turkey to Azerbaijan via Iran and then Russia, or whether it was between the Levant and Israel all the way to India via Persian Gulf countries, or north-south going from Saudi Arabia all the way to Turkey, from Africa, west of Africa, all the way to the Gulf and then to the east. And so the Middle East also sees that in a world of economic political rivalries, it sits right in the middle. And it is part of that geopolitics of trade and economic sets of relations. So countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia see themselves in that vein. And finally, let me finish by saying something about Gaza. Until now, we thought, if you went back to October 6th, you would have thought that the only really urgent non-economic issue in this region involves Iran and its nuclear program and US-Iran, ongoing US-Iran confrontation. The Gaza war, the Palestinian issue, basically came out of nowhere. The United States, maybe many countries in the region had written it off, that the issue is over. We were talking about Saudi-Israeli normalization on the eve of the war. We had the Abraham Accords. And the Gaza war has not only taken us back to a period where the Arab-Israeli issue, where issues in the Levant really are decisive, but I think it has rewritten the geostrategy for the region and global geopolitics in ways that we don't know all the way. I mean, the reaction of the West, the way they have played this is very critical, not only in terms that Bruno Macias said that, yes, they have lost tremendous amount of credibility in the region, but it's for the first time that they're seeing that the West is actually not playing a role at all. They're following events. They're following events that basically Israel or Hamas are right now directing on the ground, and the United States does not have a policy to end the war, does not have a policy for what happens after the war, has no clear policy for preventing it from escalating. And so it's really left to the region itself to figure out what it's going to do. And I think, you know, we are also saying again that even though the United States wanted to leave this region, geopolitics of this region, and to move to Asia, that in a way, you know, geopolitics has come back to the Middle East in a big way. But how it's going to play out will have to be decided.
Thank you, Ali. Bruno, now, you touched on a couple interesting points in your opening comments. One of the things I want to ask you about, age of conquest. I've actually used this phrase just yesterday talking with friends about what's going on. I found it very interesting that you used it as well. Are we entering a period right now in geopolitics where the borders are being blurred, where borders may change? We're seeing a possible annexation of Crimea that could become maybe recognized internationally in a couple of years. Gaza Strip, other possible flashpoints being Taiwan. There's frozen conflicts that could be reheated again, like Kashmir. So have we entered an age of conquest? And also, within that answer, I want you to also talk about international law. Is it now optional? If it's optional, what's going to replace it?
Yes, I think it is optional. We now talk about rules-based order, as you know, and I'm not as critical as that idea as people who spoke yesterday. It seemed to me that the idea meant essentially that we don't know what the rules are. They have to be decided in a process that was left very obscure. But we want a world order that is based on rules rather than discretion or rather than actions on the ground. And I think that demand still stands. The world we're entering, I think we all assume, will be temporary and a new kind of order will be established. We cannot exist in the age of conquest interminably. Now, I fear that rather than rules-based order, what we have is a rules-based disorder, because the struggle is to create the rules. And it's a very intense struggle or competition to create the rules, which obviously appears to us as disorder or chaos. I think we'll be going through a period where, yes, there will be more wars, there will be territorial conquests. We're already seeing that. Demons are out of the box, and the language coming from Israel, of course, is the language of occupation, expulsion. This seems to be the way to solve problems that is increasingly appealing to people because the rules have disappeared and there is no punishment, there is no accountability. But I have to say that at the same time, while this is happening, it's not that we went back to a world where only military action or military force matters. There's another game being played in the background, which is about technology and which is about the economy and which is about trade. And that's a game primarily involving China. China seems to me, I just came back from an extended period there. China seems to me to be playing a long game of transforming the world system from within, of creating the essential structures of how the world economy works, the trade patterns, the trade connections, the trade routes, but also the technological poles, and trying to replace the United States in the role of being the technological trailblazer, being always a little bit ahead of everyone else. That's a great source of power. What strikes me is that the United States used to exercise power in a rather structural or indirect way. That was the virtue of the American empire. that it was not direct and blunt, but worked through the structure of the world system. And now the United States has renounced this role, has renounced the role of being a kind of the programmer of the world system. It's become a player. It's declined from its role of programmer into the role of simply one more player. It seems to be that it's China that is slowly, but very thoughtfully, trying to occupy the role of world programmer. This is what the Belt and Road is about. This is what many of China's initiatives are about. In a way, not to be a player, but to be the agent that sets the rules for everyone else.
Thank you, Bruno. Charles, Vali said the US went from leading to following the leader. Bruno just said the US went from being the programmer to being the player. Do you agree with this?
No. I think that at least as Bruno put it, it's a bit overstated from my perspective. And I think that there still is a rules-based order out there. It is not a universal one, as we are seeing on a day-by-day, hourly basis. And I think it's always been contested, and that the United States has always tried to navigate a world in which it wants to uphold a set of rules, but at times those rules infringe on sovereignty, infringe upon the U.S. ability to pursue its national interests. And so there's been an ever-present tension, and we see that tension today. And in the case of the U.S. position vis-a-vis Israel, you know, it's important to keep in mind that Israel is reacting to an act by Hamas which violated the rules-based order. Then we can have a conversation about is Israel's response itself violating the rules-based order, and is it disproportionate? And I think most of us would probably say yes. But these are complicated issues that are morally fraught, and I think that on both sides of the ledger one can make strong arguments. I think the bigger issue is, number one, is the United States going to be on a trajectory in which it tries to continue to uphold that order? And I don't know the answer to that question. I think the elections next year will be very important. And number two, what about the rest of the world? And I think there was, in some ways, an illusion in the 1990s that this order built by the West could be universalized. Well, that's not happening. And as a consequence, we need to figure out how can we shift and moderate and adapt a rules-based order to get buy-in from China, from Turkey, from the Saudis. And that's gonna be a difficult task because, as you mentioned, Yusuf, civilizations matter. Different parts of the world play by different kinds of rules. So we're gonna have to find some way of building consensus.
They definitely do. And I just want to ask you one more question. You talked a little about democratic backsliding. You also talked about countries hedging their bets. And you just mentioned US elections. And as the American on the panel, I want to ask you about the US always had the moral high ground in international affairs. And for better or worse, it used that as a model, sometimes as a weapon. But we have seen a tremendous amount of democratic backsliding, at least by US standards, from what you expect to see in the United States. How do you think elections, regardless of we see Biden win as the incumbent, or we see the return of Trump, or some other independent or Republican or Democratic candidate, how are countries reacting to that democratic backsliding, and how is it going to play out over the next couple of years?
Well, you know, I'm someone who thinks that the United States, on balance, has played a very positive role in the world. And it's done so less by use of force and more by example, by producing a model of liberal democracy and prosperity and multiculturalism that much of the rest of the world emulated. And I think it's troubling that the United States has been stumbling on that front, and that we see polarization, that we see the emergence of intercommunal tensions. For me, it all comes down to economics. It all comes down to the degree to which the onset of the digital age has decreased the earning power of many working Americans, has led to a situation in which there's pervasive economic insecurity, and that opens the door to identity politics and to the politics of grievance. And that's why, for me, getting our own houses in order is priority number one, because I do think that the world will be a better place if there are models out there of liberal democracies that are delivering for their citizens. Because ultimately, we are in a competition between democracy and autocracy. Democracy will win because it outperforms the alternatives. But right now, it is not demonstrating the kinds of capacities to deliver that it has historically.
Thank you. Wally, when you were talking, you were highlighting China and its rise to power. What happens when China overtakes the United States as the premier economic power of the world? Because we do have a very interconnected global economic system that's without a doubt. More and more countries are turning to China. The United States is trying to rally its allies to address the rising of China as a global power, but we're seeing US allies backpedal or drag their feet on countering China, yet they're much more decisive on countering Russia. So what happens when that moment in history comes and China is now the premier economic power in the world?
I mean, first of all, we don't know if China will be the premier economic power in the world. We don't know if that's going to be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, even if that were to be the case. I think, there's a way of looking at this issue sitting in the West and looking sort of at a higher level and thinking about this global power rivalry. It's very clear that the United States at least has set in its mind that China is going to be surpassing it, and it has to stop it right now. But if you're sitting in the Middle East, if you're one of the countries in the Middle East, you're going to gauge what does this mean, all of this mean for you. So partly, even before China surpasses the United States, what does this ongoing conflict between United States and China mean? What does the overwhelming amount of diplomatic, military, strategic attention that the United States is paying China mean for this region? So I think for the geopolitics of the Middle East, for countries like Turkey, this interregnum, what Charlie referred to, is pretty important. That's where we're living right now. I don't know what's going to happen in 10, 15 years. Right now, these countries are seeing certain opportunity because they can play China against the US, US against China. Partly they are hedging because they are seeing these shifts going on. But I think the most important thing is this, is that for a very long time, I really don't think the United States' rules-based order ever had credibility in the region. Because the United States did not actually implement a lot of its values in the region. It supported dictatorial regimes. It invaded Iraq on charges that most Middle Easterners thought were flimsy charges. Its support for Israel was always decried in the Arab world. So I don't think the region ever looked at the United States for its rules-based international order. But it looked to the United States for order. It actually believed that the US was capable of producing an order and defending it. And that's why I'm saying the example of Afghanistan is actually very, very huge in the sense that after 20 years, the very force that the United States pushed out of Afghanistan is back in power, and all that the United States is left with is just to impose sanctions on the Taliban. It can't do much else. So the key question is, for the region, is that are they going to be living in a prolonged period of no particular order in the region? It falls on the countries of the region to figure out the order and defend their borders, etc. or the United States will be back to reimpose the order, or is it China that will impose the order? And I think that's a huge black box. You know, what does an ascendant China mean for the region? So looking at it from bottom up, I think the key issue is what sort of order? And I would just add one other thing, the issues that Charlie raised about the democratic backsliding in the United States. Again, if you're sitting in the region, you might not cry tears for loss of democracy in the US, you don't live there. But it also suggests that you literally have to wait a year before the American policy towards the Middle East gets turned upside down, right? I mean, the United States for the first time has become the most sort of unpredictable player here. Whether you're Putin or you're Ayatollah Khamenei or you're Bibi Netanyahu or Mohammed bin Salman, I mean, the United States is no longer taken as a reliable sort of international actor.
Could we say that's because the United States has reached the limits of its power finally? Could that reaching of the limits of its power where it can only handle or intervene or coordinate so many global events at one time, and after a while those finite resources that it has have reached its limit? Is this one of the reasons why maybe geopolitics is returning? Because it's coming up, I shouldn't say coming apart at the seams, but it's reached the limits of the finite resources it has to be able to lead that system, this previous system.
Well, that's partly it, but also I think partly it's self-inflicted wounds because there's too much chaos in the United States itself, as Charlie said. And secondly, there are cases where the United States can be far more decisive in different ways, like right now in the war in Gaza. This is a choice by the United States to follow the kinds of policies that it does. It's not a symptom of its not having power. It has tremendous amount of power in that particular arena. It has a tremendous amount of power on all the actors in that arena, on Israel, on Jordan, on Saudi Arabia, on Egypt. It chooses not to play that role, right? It chooses not to have a policy right now of going from capital to capital and saying, this is the way we see this war ending if you do X, Y, and Z. And what do you think? Right now, the United States is not committed to nothing more than a temporary ceasefire, which didn't work out. So literally, the maximum step in US policy is to say, we expect Israel not to kill as many people who died in the first phase of the war. But that's not a policy. That's just a statement, right? It's not a, and I think that part is not a symptom of anything fundamental. It's a symptom of the way in which right now it's chosen to operate.
Thank you. Bruno, you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. You were at an event, and Vale also talked about global trade routes. Now, I always like to touch on historical periods where we just talked about the age of conquest before. This is also kind of the golden age of trade, a new Silk Road, an age of discovery where new trade routes are being built. You have Global Gateway for the EU. You have Build Back Better for the United States, Belt and Road Initiative for China. Turkey has its own initiatives in Central Asia, the Development Road, working on it with Iraq. India has the Middle East corridor that it's been talking about, was presented at the G20 meeting. What do these trade corridors mean for the future? Are we in an era right now where global trade is being rewritten and these trade corridors will create new trade giants and new supply lines?
Yes, to some extent, but I think it needs to be properly understood. In my book on the Belt and Road, I was very concerned with criticizing this idea that the Belt and Road is about trains. Everyone seemed to think that it was about trains. It obviously isn't. The processes are much more immaterial. They're about technology transfer, technology development, supply chains, the very complex network of value chains existing in the world, and the significant nodes connecting the value chains where you can exert power. So I don't think we should get too fixated on geography. I don't think Ukraine and Gaza have refuted the idea that we have, to a considerable extent, moved beyond geography. And I see a great awareness of this in China. So these trade routes exist, but remember that famous map of the Belt and Road Initiative, which by the way was by a news agency, not by the Chinese government, had these very large arrows, 6 arrows pointing in all directions. But those were not train railways. Those were meant to be arrows of influence. So in the end, the most important thing to think about is influence and how it's being developed and how it's being reconfigured, rather than railways, roads, or even ports. And a lot of it is about technology. The big question today, in my mind, I think it's the big question we should be following, is whether China will be able to evade the technological blockade that the United States has imposed on it. By the way, on October 7th, 2022, so 2 very important October 7th, the US launched this really bold and aggressive array of measures trying to blockade China's technological development. The latest news is that China seems to be on the verge of evading it, but we don't know if it will be possible. The United States is reacting to those news. But this is the big question, because if China does evade it and become technological self-sufficient, then it is a new world. No doubt about that.
Thank you, Bruno. Charles, you served as a special assistant to the President for European Affairs. Now, as US-EU relations, but also more broader when we look at that relationship, we're actually talking about the transatlantic community and most namely NATO. We've seen a lot of, let's say, division inside of NATO regarding many issues. How to approach China. The US wants to see a more coordinated, maybe a more confrontational, but when I mean confrontational, not militarily, but a more confrontational by military, political means, by many issues. Also, regarding terrorism, counterterrorism, their approach, the Turkish president has said terrorism in all its forms, not just terrorism that threatens certain NATO member countries. How do you see the future of NATO? How do you see NATO adopting and adapting to the return of geopolitics?
If I could just make a quick comment on the previous discussion and then come to that. I think we all agree on the panel that we are in a moment of history of change in the global distribution of power, but I wouldn't want to kind of overstate it in the sense that the United States still does wield enormous capability, still has the #1 economy and will have so for a long time. If you look at things militarily, nobody comes close. Dollar, still the main reserve currency. So for me, it's more about the purposes of US power, whether the United States is on a steady and purposeful course. So it's really more about the politics than it is about the power. And I think because the US will continue to have more resources than others, this is the critical moment to have this kind of debate, because I do think that the window will close over time as power gets redistributed. Yusuf, I would say that particularly looking at the reaction to the war in Ukraine, transatlantic solidarity is extraordinarily impressive. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to a level of resolve and unity across the Atlantic that I have to say I'm surprised by. That on supporting Ukraine, sanctioning Russia, beefing up NATO's eastern flank, the US and its European partners have been remarkably steady. I would have said by now they will go wobbly. And I think we are at a point in which they may go wobbly, right? As we speak, Congress is debating the next dollop of aid to Ukraine. We don't know where that's going to come out. Slovakia has said we're no longer sending arms to Ukraine. So we are at a point in which there is debate, and sort of looking ahead, I would identify 3 quick areas where I think NATO really does need to think hard and long. One is Ukraine. Where are we going? We have a military stalemate now in the East. We have to ask, what now? Does it make sense for Ukraine to just keep fighting, Or should we focus more on rebuilding the 82% of Ukraine under Kyiv's control, try to get the parties to the diplomatic table? 2 is China. We don't have a transatlantic strategy toward China. I think the two sides of the Atlantic have come together on this issue, but they're still far apart. And then 3, I think, is the get our own houses in order question. And I mentioned mainly my own country, but I do worry about the political center in France, the political center in Germany. How long will the center hold in those countries?
Thank you. We're almost out of time. One question, all 3 of you, very quick answer. You heard Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan speak yesterday at keynote address, and he's a leader that always likes to look at the big picture. If you were his advisor and you could tell him one thing to prepare for the return of geopolitics, what would that be? What would you advise the Turkish president on?
You're starting with me.
All 3 of you, one by one, starting with you, Ali.
It's a very difficult question and one for a very short answer. I think actually Turkey has played a very deft geopolitical game, and not just very recently, but over the past number of decades of positioning itself between East and the West as a great power in the Middle East, but also as a player in Europe and reacting to the tides of its relations with EU and NATO. Sometimes it doesn't go always well, particularly viewed from Washington that Turkey is not basically following what NATO might want. But I think Turkey is archetypal of the countries that we've been talking about, of emerging powers that are trying to find their footing and in this current environment and assert their great power status.
Thank you, Vali. Bruno, what would you advise the Turkish president on for the future?
Okay, two suggestions. One, I think everyone in the Turkish government is very aware of, develop indigenous military capacities, and this seems to be a priority. Number 2, on Gaza, why not have a summit with Egypt, Jordan, and perhaps other partners in the region? Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, perhaps Saudi, perhaps Iran, to discuss Gaza. You would send a really, really strong and important message about regional realignment that would be heard in Washington, that would be heard in Tel Aviv. But I don't see Mr. Fahrettin Altun in the room, so this may all go to waste.
Definitely not going to waste, but from what I hear, they are working on a summit where it would be hosted in Turkey. But
okay.
Hopefully developments on that soon. Charles, you're sitting down with the Turkish president, you're whispering something into his ear to prepare the country for the next decade. What would you advise him on? What would that be?
Stay anchored in the West.
Stay in the West.
I think that Turkey has an important role to play. It's shown its capabilities in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Syria. But I do think if Turkey is going to play this role of bridge between East and West, it ought to keep itself firmly anchored in the West. That gives it the voice in the West and the leverage that it needs going forward.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard our speakers, Dr. Vali Nasser, Dr. Charles Kupchan, Dr. Bruno Macias. All 3 doctors, they have operated on the issue, and it looks like our patient is still alive. Thank you very much. I'm Yusuf Aram, editor-at-large at TRT World, and our panel is closed.